The late 18th century was a time when the world seemed to be cracking open. Empires that once felt eternal were suddenly trembling beneath the weight of rebellion, revolution, and new ideas about freedom. Across the Atlantic, in Europe, monarchs still wore crowns with the certainty of divine right, but in the Americas, a different kind of fire had been lit. The United States' struggle for independence in 1776 had not only broken Britain's grip over 13 colonies, it had also sent shockwaves across the continent. The echo of liberty's call reached far beyond the Appalachians, far beyond the Mississippi, and deep into the heart of New Spain. The vast colonial empire ruled by Spain, which stretched from California down to Central America. For Mexico, this was more than a story of distant neighbors winning freedom. It was a mirror of possibilities. If Britain could be cast off, could Spain? If George Washington could rally farmers and tradesmen against one of the most powerful armies in the world, could a priest, a general, or a visionary do the same in Mexico? But in the 1770s and 1780s, Spain's rule was still firm. Mexico City, the capital of New Spain, bustled with Spanish wealth and colonial authority. Plaza Mayor, the grand square later called the Zocalo, was a stage where Spanish viceroys paraded their power. Cathedrals stood tall, built upon the ruins of ancient Aztec temples, as if to remind the people that empires rise and fall. But conquest endures. Yet beneath this glittering colonial surface, resentment smoldered. The vast majority of Mexico's population, indigenous people, mestizos of mixed blood, poor farmers, and laborers, lived under the boot of inequality. Spanish-born elites, the peninsulares, monopolized the highest offices, while Criollo Spaniards born in the Americas were barred from many privileges. Even wealthy Criollos could not escape the feeling of being second-class, subjects in their own land. And then there was the church. The Catholic Church in Mexico was not just a spiritual institution, was one of the wealthiest landowners, with vast estates and a firm grip on the people's lives. Priests were community leaders, but the church also reinforced Spain's dominance, reminding people of their duty to crown and cross alike. Still, among some clergy, whispers of freedom began to stir. Meanwhile, north of the border, the fledgling United States was experimenting with a radical idea: a republic governed by its people rather than a distant king. As word spread through newspapers, travelers, and merchants, the story of America's independence inspired restless hearts in Mexico. If liberty could be won in the north, why not here? But Spain was watching. Spain had actually aided the American colonists during their revolution, sending money, supplies, and soldiers not out of love for liberty, but to weaken Britain. Yet this alliance had unintended consequences. By supporting American independence, Spain had indirectly planted seeds of rebellion within its own empire. Throughout the 1790s, the winds of revolution only grew stronger. The French Revolution had toppled monarchy in Europe, and the Haitian Revolution, the only successful slave revolt in history, had shattered colonial power in the Caribbean. The lesson was clear: empires could bleed, and they could fall. Mexico's people took note. In secret gatherings, Criollos and priests began discussing independence. They read about Thomas Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence. They whispered about Washington, Lafayette, Bolivar, and Toussaint Louverture. A sense of destiny began to form. Still, rebellion in Mexico would be far more complicated than in the United States. The U.S. had been a string of relatively homogeneous colonies with a strong sense of shared grievance. Mexico was a mosaic of cultures, languages, and histories. Indigenous nations, mestizos, Spaniards, Africans, and others, all bound unequally under colonial rule. Could such a divided land unite against Spain? The question hung heavy over the late 1700s. For now, Mexico remained under the watchful eyes of Spanish soldiers, its plazas echoing with the footsteps of colonial power. But in villages and towns, far from the capital, the people were restless. The day would come when one man would ring a church bell, and the echo would forever change Mexico. But before that moment, the world had to shift. And Mexico had to watch as revolution remade its neighbors. The dawn of revolutions had begun. And Mexico's time was drawing near. Asterisk by the early 1800s, Mexico was a land simmering with unrest. The echoes of the American and French revolutions had reached its villages and cities. And the colony's deep divisions were becoming impossible to ignore. Spain itself was weakening. In 1808, Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Spain and placed his brother, Joseph, on the Spanish throne. Across the Atlantic, this created a crisis of legitimacy. If Spain's king had been deposed, who truly ruled Mexico? Did loyalty still belong to a crown controlled by a French emperor? Or was it time for Mexico to rule itself? This uncertainty struck a nerve with Criollas American-born Spaniards, who had long been barred from the highest offices despite their wealth and education. The elites in Mexico City debated furiously, some supporting loyalty to Spain, others quietly advocating independence. But in the countryside, the people's grievances were more immediate. Poverty, hunger, and centuries of oppression under colonial rule had bred resentment. It was in this atmosphere that one man prepared to light the spark of revolution. Father Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla was no ordinary priest. He was highly educated, fluent in multiple languages, and fascinated by Enlightenment thought. Unlike many conservative clergy, he read works of banned French philosophers, questioned the injustices of the caste system, and sympathized deeply with the struggles of the poor. In his parish of Dolores, in central Mexico, he became a beloved figure. He opened workshops for farmers and taught them crafts to improve their livelihoods. But he also whispered about liberty, about a future free from Spain's control by 1810. Hidalgo had joined a growing conspiracy of criollos and priests who plotted to overthrow Spanish rule. The plan was to rise up in December, during a great festival when Spanish authorities would be distracted. But fate intervened. The conspiracy was discovered earlier than expected, and Spanish officials prepared to arrest the plotters. Hidalgo had no choice. The time to act was now or never. In the early hours of September 16, 1810, the church bell in Dolores rang out, not to call the faithful to Mass, but to summon them to revolution. Villagers gathered in confusion, and there, standing before them with fiery eyes and a commanding voice, Father Hidalgo delivered what would become known as the grito. Dolores, the cry of Dolores. His words have been remembered in different versions, but the essence was clear. Long live Our Lady of Guadalupe. Death to bad government. Death to the Spaniards. Long live independence. With that cry, centuries of Spanish rule began to tremble. The people responded with passion. Farmers, peasants, and laborers seized machetes, clubs, and any weapon they could find. They rallied behind Hidalgo, carrying a banner of the Virgin of Guadalupe as their symbol. In a matter of days, Hidalgo's movement swelled into an army, tens of thousands strong. This was not a revolution led by polished generals or well-equipped armies. It was a rebellion of the common people, of the poor rising against centuries of oppression. But it terrified Spain. The colonial authorities in Mexico City scrambled to defend themselves as news spread like wildfire. The villages were rising, and Hidalgo's cry was becoming the anthem of a nation not yet born. The United States watched carefully. Some American traders smuggled weapons to the rebels, hoping to weaken Spain's influence in North America. Others worried that such a violent uprising could spill over and destabilize their own young republic. Either way, the fire had been lit, and nothing would put it out. From the ringing of a bell in a small town, Mexico's fight for independence had begun. It was bloody, chaotic and uncertain, but it was unstoppable. The Grito de Dolores would forever be remembered as the moment Mexico's people claimed their right to freedom. Asterisk. The cry of Father Miguel Hidalgo had set Mexico ablaze. What began as a small-town uprising surged into a massive rebellion. By late 1810, tens of thousands of peasants marched under Hidalgo's banner, carrying not muskets but machetes, pitchforks, and sheer determination. Hidalgo's army swept through central Mexico with startling speed. Towns and villages, weary of Spanish oppression, opened their gates to him. The Virgin of Guadalupe, emblazoned on his banner, became a unifying symbol. She was not only the spiritual mother of Mexico, but also a reminder that this struggle was not just political, it was deeply tied to faith, culture, and identity. But with this great surge of passion came chaos. Many of the rebels, long subjected to abuse and poverty, turned their rage against symbols of Spanish power. Peninsular Spaniards born in Europe became targets. Homes of the wealthy were looted, and Spanish authorities fled in terror. Hidalgo, a man of ideals, struggled to control the fury of his own army. By October 1810, Hidalgo's force had grown to nearly 80,000 men, an overwhelming tide compared to the smaller, disciplined Spanish garrisons. He marched toward Mexico City, the heart of Spanish rule, where panic spread among the authorities. For a moment, it seemed that independence might be won in a single strike, but hesitation proved fatal at the gates of Mexico City. Hidalgo faltered. Historians debate why. Perhaps he feared that unleashing his army of peasants into the capital would result in uncontrollable bloodshed. Perhaps he doubted his ability to govern if victory came too soon. Or perhaps he still held on to a hope for negotiation. Whatever the reason, Hidalgo turned back. This retreat gave Spain precious time to regroup. Royalist forces, though smaller, were professional soldiers with better weapons and discipline. Under commanders like Felix Maria Calleja, they launched counterattacks. The rebel tide began to falter. By January 1811, Hidalgo suffered a crushing defeat at the Battle of Calderon Bridge, where Spanish cannons tore through his untrained army. His dream of a quick victory crumbled. Forced to retreat northward, Hidalgo was eventually betrayed, captured, and executed by firing squad in July 1811. His severed head was displayed in Guanajuato as a grim warning. This is what happens to those who defy Spain, but the revolution did not die with him. Leadership passed to new figures. Among them, José María Morelos, another priest but a far more disciplined military commander. Where Hidalgo inspired, Morelos organized. From 1811 to 1815, Morelos transformed scattered peasant uprisings into a more structured insurgency. He envisioned not just independence, but also social reform, abolishing slavery, ending the caste system, and redistributing land. Under Morelos, the rebels captured key cities in southern Mexico and even convened the Congress of Chilpancingo in 1813. There, it declared Mexico's independence formally and drafted a constitution. For the first time, Mexico was not just fighting against Spain, was imagining itself as a sovereign nation. Yet Spain was relentless. With reinforcements arriving and divisions growing among the rebels, Morelos too was eventually captured. In 1815, he was executed by firing squad. For the next several years, the revolution simmered as a guerrilla war. Leaders like Vicente Guerrero and Guadalupe Victoria carried on the struggle, striking from mountains and jungles, refusing to surrender. They kept the dream alive even as Spain celebrated victory after victory. Meanwhile, the world was changing. In Spain itself, liberal revolutions rose and fell, weakening the monarchy's grip on its colonies. Across Latin America, other independence movements gained ground: Simón Bolívar in the north, José de San Martín in the south. The Spanish Empire was crumbling, piece by piece, by 1820. Spain was too weak to crush Mexico's rebellion completely. And in an ironic twist, the final push for independence would come not only from guerrilla fighters, but also from a royalist general, who switched sides, Agustin de Iturbide. But that dramatic turn lay ahead. For now, the revolution had proven one truth: though its leaders could be executed, though its armies could be scattered, the idea of an independent Mexico could not be killed. The struggle of 1810 to 1821 was a decade of blood and sacrifice. Villages burned, families fled, and fields were soaked in the price of freedom. Yet through the smoke and ruin, a nation was slowly being born. The long war had drained Mexico. For more than a decade, blood had stained its soil. The first wave, led by Hidalgo and Morelos, had flared brightly but was crushed by Spain's iron grip. Yet through guerrilla fighters like Vicente Guerrero, the fire never fully went out. Spain could control the cities, but the rugged countryside remained stubbornly rebellious. By 1820, the situation had shifted dramatically, not only in Mexico, but also across the Spanish Empire. Spain itself was weak and unstable. A liberal revolt in the mother country forced the Spanish crown to restore the Constitution of 1812, the document that limited royal power and granted more rights to citizens. Many conservatives in Mexico, especially the wealthy criollos and the Catholic Church, were horrified. They had supported Spain partly because it preserved their privileges. Now, under a liberal constitution, their dominance was threatened. Ironically, this fear pushed them closer to the very independence movement they had resisted for years. Enter Agustin de Iturbide, a Spanish royalist officer. For most of the war, Iturbide had fought fiercely against the insurgents, earning a reputation for ruthlessness. But now, sensing the winds of change and realizing that Mexico's elites were leaning toward independence, he saw an opportunity to position himself as the man who could unite both sides. In 1821, Iturbide reached out to Vicente Guerrero, one of the most resilient rebel leaders still fighting in the South. At first, the idea of joining forces with a former enemy seemed impossible. Guerrero had fought in the mountains for years, his troops living off scraps, loyal only to the dream of independence. But Iturbide was persuasive. He proposed a plan that could finally bring Mexico's struggle to a victorious end. This plan became known as the Plan of Iguala. It rested on 3 guarantees, symbolized in a new flag of green, white, and red stripes. Religion: Mexico would remain Catholic, preserving the Church's power. Independence: Mexico would break free from Spain. Unity: all social. Classes, criollos and peninsulares alike, would be treated equally. For Guerrero and his fighters, the promise of independence outweighed the compromises. For conservatives and the Church, the plan offered security. And for Iturbide, it was a path to power. The alliance was sealed. Former enemies now marched together under one banner, the Army of the 3 Guarantees. By the summer of 1821, the momentum was unstoppable. Spanish forces, weakened and divided, could no longer contain the movement. Town after town accepted the new order, raising the tricolor flag of Iguala. On August 24, 1821, Spain's representatives signed the Treaty of Cordoba, recognizing Mexico's independence. On September 27, 1821, Iturbide led his army triumphantly into Mexico City. Streets overflowed with cheering crowds. Fireworks lit the sky, church bells rang, and tears of joy flowed freely. After 3 centuries of colonial rule, Mexico was free. But freedom came with complications. Almost immediately, questions of governance arose. Would Mexico be a republic, like the United States, or a monarchy, as Iturbide himself envisioned? For now, Mexicans celebrated the victory. But the seeds of future conflict were already sown. Still, the achievement was monumental. After 11 years of blood and sacrifice, Mexico had done what once seemed impossible. It had cast off the rule of Spain. From the Cry of Dolores in 1810 to the triumphant march of 1821, a nation had been born in fire, yet its birth was fragile. Independence had been won, but unity remained elusive. And across the northern border, the United States watched with great interest. Seeing in Mexico both a new neighbor and a potential rival, the struggle was over. But the story of Mexico's survival had only just begun. The United States, having expanded rapidly across the continent, was gripped by a new idea: manifest destiny. Coined in the 1840s, this belief held that the United States was destined, even divinely ordained, to expand across North America. From the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific, expansion was no longer just an ambition. It was framed as a duty. Mexico, meanwhile, was facing an internal crisis. The young republic had secured independence from Spain in 1821, but its political stability was fragile. The central government was weak, plagued by regional uprisings, economic difficulties, and struggles over whether Mexico should be governed as a federal republic or a centralized state. The United States saw opportunity in Mexico's instability. Texas, sparsely populated by Mexicans, yet rich in land, became the center of attention. Mexico encouraged Anglo-American settlers to move into Texas in the 1820s, hoping they would develop the region economically. But these settlers brought enslaved African Americans with them, clashing with Mexico's 1829 abolition of slavery. Tensions escalated. The Texans, heavily influenced by American settlers, soon began pushing for autonomy. By the 1830s, disputes over land, governance, and slavery led to open conflict. Mexico's leader, General Antonio López de Santa Anna, sought to reassert control. The showdown was near. The Texas Revolution erupted in 1835 when settlers and Tejano allies resisted Mexican authority. One of the most iconic moments came in 1836, the Battle of the Alamo. For 13 days, a small band of Texan defenders, including William B. Travis, James Bowie, and the legendary Davy Crockett, held out against Santa Anna's vastly larger army. In the end, every Texan defender was killed. Though a defeat, the Alamo became a rallying cry. Remember the Alamo? Soon after, Texan forces, led by Sam Houston, decisively defeated Santa Anna at the Battle of San Jacinto. Mexico was forced to recognize Texas's independence, though it never formally accepted the loss of the territory. For nearly a decade, Texas existed as an independent republic. But its leaders wanted U.S. annexation. This desire alarmed Mexico, which viewed annexation as a direct provocation. The United States hesitated at first, partly due to fears of angering Mexico, and partly because annexation would intensify the national debate over slavery. By 1845, however, US President James K. Polk, a staunch believer in manifest destiny, embraced annexation. In December of that year, Texas officially joined the United States. Mexico, furious, broke off diplomatic relations. War was no longer a matter of if, but when. By the 1830s, the northern Mexican territory of Texas had become a flashpoint. Many Anglo-American settlers, known as Texians, had moved into the region under Mexico's land grant system. But tensions grew between these settlers and the Mexican government. Disputes over language, culture, and especially slavery deepened the rift. Mexico had outlawed slavery in 1829, but many American settlers in Texas ignored the law, creating open defiance against Mexican authority. In 1835, anger boiled over into open revolt. The Texas Revolution had begun. The most famous event was the Battle of the Alamo in 1836. A small group of Texian defenders, including Davy Crockett, William B. Travis, and Jim Bowie, held out for 13 days against a far larger Mexican force led by General Santa Anna. Despite their bravery, the defenders were overwhelmed and killed. The cry of "Remember the Alamo" became a rallying call for Texians, who soon after defeated Santa Anna at the Battle of San Jacinto. Securing Texas independence, the newly declared Republic of Texas was born, though Mexico never recognized it. After winning independence, the Republic of Texas existed as its own nation from 1836 to 1845, but the Texians, most of whom were Anglo-Americs, sought annexation into the United States. For nearly a decade, the U.S. hesitated, fearful that annexing Texas would spark war with Mexico and deepen divisions at home over slavery. But in 1845, President James K. Polk, a strong believer in manifest destiny, approved the annexation of Texas into the United States. Mexico saw this as an act of aggression. To them, Texas was still Mexican land. Tensions escalated quickly, particularly over the disputed border. The U.S. claimed the Rio Grande River as the boundary, while Mexico insisted it was the Nueces River. Further north, skirmishes erupted along the disputed territory, and the stage was set for full-scale conflict. By the middle of 1847, the Mexican-American War had entered its bloodiest phase. The earlier victories at Palo Alto, Resaca de la Palma, and Monterrey had emboldened American leaders. Yet Mexico, though wounded, was far from beaten. President Santa Anna reorganized his army and prepared to defend the heartland with renewed determination. The siege of Veracruz's American strategy turned seaward. General Winfield Scott, known as Old Fuss and Feathers, led a massive amphibious landing at Veracruz in March 1847, the largest such operation in American history up to that point. The U.S. Navy unleashed a devastating bombardment on the fortified city. Buildings crumbled, fires spread, and terrified civilians sought refuge in churches. After days of pounding, Veracruz surrendered. The port's fall opened the gateway to the Mexican heartland, and for the first time, U.S. troops were poised to march inland toward Mexico City. But the price was steep. Mexican civilians endured untold suffering, and disease ravaged soldiers on both sides. For many, Veracruz symbolized not just military conquest, but also the human cost of war. Cerro Gordo, the road to the capital from Veracruz. Scott's army marched westward, following the same path Hernan Cortes had taken 3 centuries earlier during the Spanish conquest. The route was treacherous. Narrow mountain passes, dense forests, and brutal heat challenged every step. In April 1847, the Mexican army, under Santa Anna, attempted to block the Americans at the Battle of Cerro Gordo. The terrain gave Mexico a strong defensive advantage, with artillery positioned on steep cliffs. But through daring maneuvers, American forces outflanked the Mexican position. The result was a crushing defeat for Santa Anna. Hundreds of Mexican soldiers were killed or captured, and vast stores of supplies fell into U.S. hands. American soldiers began to believe that victory and Huiquil City itself was within their grasp. Occupation and resistance as Scott's forces pushed deeper. They faced not just armies, but guerrilla resistance. Mexican civilians ambushed supply lines, attacked stragglers, and fought bitterly in defense of their towns. The war became increasingly brutal as American troops responded with reprisals, sometimes burning villages and executing suspected partisans. Reports of atrocities reached both Washington and Mexico City, inflaming public opinion. For many Mexicans, the war was no longer simply about defending territory. It was about survival, identity, and dignity in the face of a powerful invader. Approaching the Valley of Mexico by late summer 1847, Scott's army approached the Valley of Mexico, a high plateau ringed by mountains and lakes. It was the historic heart of the nation, where Aztec emperors had once ruled from Tenochtitlan. Now, the Americans prepared to fight their way into Mexico's sacred capital. Santa Anna, desperate to defend the city, fortified key positions along the approaches. The battles that followed, Contreras, Churubusco, Molino, Del Rey, and ultimately, Chapultepec, would become legendary for their ferocity and their symbolic weight. The war was reaching its climax. The fate of Mexico and the balance of power in North America hung in the balance. By the early 1830s. Mexico's northern territories were vast, sparsely populated, and vulnerable. Among them was Texas, where Mexican authorities had encouraged settlement by Anglo-American colonists, known as Texians. At first, this seemed like a practical solution. The immigrants brought farming skills, livestock, and tools. But soon, Mexico realized that many settlers were not loyal to Mexico. They clung to their American roots, resisted adopting Catholicism, and bristled at Mexican laws. The cultural clash grew sharper when Mexico, having abolished slavery in 1829, prohibited the practice within its territory. Many Texian settlers, however, had brought enslaved laborers and refused to give them up. This became one of the most explosive points of tension. By 1835, discontent reached its boiling point. Texians and Tejano allies, who favored more autonomy, rose in armed revolt against Mexican rule. Their rallying cry, "Independence for Texas." One of the earliest sparks came at Gonzales, where Texian rebels famously hoisted a crude flag bearing the words "Come and take it" as they defended a small cannon from Mexican soldiers. The symbolism was clear. Texians would not bow to Mexico City's decrees. The rebellion quickly escalated into a full-scale conflict. In 1836, Mexican President and General Antonio López de Santa Anna personally led thousands of troops north to crush the insurgents. He sought to make an example of Texas, showing that Mexico's authority could not be defied. What followed was a series of iconic and bloody encounters that would forever shape both Mexican and American history. By 1846, tensions between Mexico and the United States had reached a boiling point. The annexation of Texas by the United States in 1845 was seen as a direct insult to Mexican sovereignty. Mexico had never officially recognized Texas independence, and from their perspective, the U.S. had stolen land that was rightfully theirs. Diplomacy failed. President James K. Polk, a staunch believer in manifest destiny, sent American troops under General Zachary Taylor to patrol the disputed border between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande. For Mexico, this was a provocation too great to ignore. In April 1846, Mexican cavalry attacked an American patrol north of the Rio Grande, killing and capturing several soldiers. Polk used this as a rallying cry. American blood has been shed on American soil. Congress declared war. Thus began the Mexican-American War, a conflict that would redraw the map of North America and forever alter relations between the two nations. The war was fought on multiple fronts. In the north, Taylor's forces clashed with Mexican troops at Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma, securing victories that boosted American morale. Soon, U.S. forces pushed deeper into Mexico. In the west, U.S. naval forces occupied California ports, while settlers declared the short-lived Bear Flag Republic, only for it to be absorbed into U.S. control. Meanwhile, the Mexican army, though brave, suffered from poor leadership, internal divisions, and inadequate resources. President and General Antonio López de Santa Anna, who had been in exile in Cuba, returned to Mexico, promising to lead the fight. Yet his leadership, marked by indecision and costly mistakes, further weakened Mexico's position. For the United States, the war was both a military challenge and a moral one. Many Americans celebrated victories as steps toward fulfilling the nation's continental destiny. But critics, including a young congressman named Abraham Lincoln, condemned the war as an unjust land grab fueled by greed and the expansion of slavery. The stage was now set for some of the most decisive and brutal campaigns of the war. The American Invasion of Mexico reached its most dramatic moment in September 1847. The United States, under General Winfield Scott, pushed its army from Veracruz inland, defeating Mexican forces at Cerro Gordo, Contreras, and Churubusco. The road to Mexico City lay open, but one last fortress stood in their path: Chapultepec Castle, perched high on a rocky hill. Chapultepec was both a military stronghold and a symbol of Mexican sovereignty. Inside, cadets of the Mexican military, academy young men, many still teenagers, prepared to defend their homeland with desperation and honor. On the morning of September 13, 1847, American forces advanced under heavy artillery fire. Cannon roared, blasting holes in the walls of the fortress. Smoke blackened the skies as U.S. troops climbed ladders, storming the hill. Mexican defenders fought back with rifles, bayonets, and sheer courage. Among them were the Niños heroes, 6 young cadets who refused to surrender. Legend says one cadet, Juan Escutia, wrapped himself in the Mexican flag and leaped from the castle walls, choosing death over seeing his nation's colors captured. By midday, the U.S. flag flew over Chapultepec. The path to Mexico City was clear, but the cost was steep: hundreds dead on both sides, and Mexico's capital exposed to foreign occupation. For Americans, it was a victory of arms. For Mexicans, it was a wound that would never heal.